Okay, thanks. What I'm going to talk about is some work that I started about a year ago, but I also wanted to talk a bit about some of the driver for what Jeff just talked about, and that's that we being people often in engineering, but in also other fields, feel that one way to get more information about how watersheds respond to changes over time and changes due to human management is to build and calibrate and populate mathematical models of those watersheds. But in order to do that, you need quite a bit of data. And so one of the things that we've been experimenting with is collecting data in a way that we can feed those data into models as well as into databases and into reports and so on. And so a large part of our motivation for designing and implementing this monitoring network is to provide lots of data that we could use to populate models and to try to find the sweet spot between collecting data once a month or twice a month and collecting data every half hour, which is, admittedly probably a little bit of overkill. That said, what I wanted to talk about today is from that as kind of a launch point, is some of the issues that I've been looking at in terms of this title here that talks about parallelism. And Jack, you were asking about the Little Bear River and why the Little Bear River, and and we explained, and I think Doug did a nice job of capturing that the Little Bear River is interesting because it's so heavily managed and such a target of regulation. There have been total maximum daily load documents done on the upper portion, the middle portion, the reservoir, that reservoir, and then from there on it's going to go all the way down to the bird refuge. And so it's of interest to the state, and it was of interest to us because we were in the business at the time, and hopefully still are, of trying to create an instrumented watershed that people could come here from all over the place and say, this is an interesting place, and they've got lots of data, and there are human impacts or natural processes operating here. There's development, but we want to maintain a pristine agricultural community. All these kind of questions seem to swirl around this Little Bear River. And so we decided that, well, rivers, kind of by their nature, are parallel creatures. Okay? There are lots of processes going on in different places, essentially independent of processes in the other places that, as Jeff said, get integrated in a river or integrated in a lake or a reservoir or something along those lines. But studying the integrated part of a watershed doesn't tell you much about what's going on individually. So you can't look at what's going on down here and figure out what's going on in each place individually. All you can do is really set probabilities. So what our interest was, and let's turn it around and go the other way, let's look in all of these different places in a single, quote, watershed, but really an accumulation of several smaller watersheds, and then feed all of that information down to our central location to see if we can tease out from there what's going on. And one way to do that is through mathematical modeling. So I started looking at the fact that mathematical models should mirror the physical processes that are going on, and you all know this. Excuse me. And in this context, we're looking at contaminants, and our primary focus has been nutrients, but not necessarily only nutrients. Okay, so models, and here's just a list of some of the things that models do and what we need. We need hydrology, we need how watersheds respond, we need to route water and contaminants through streams, and then we look at the response of the downstream receiving waters. And so there's a long history of mathematical models over what's approaching 100 years or so now of work that's done, and even, believe it or not, predates computers. Okay, we're doing modeling even before computers were available, unless you consider a pencil and a piece of paper a computer. And so starting with the Streeter-Phelps models on dissolved oxygen in the Ohio River back in the 1920s, we've kind of progressed, and there's been a big acceleration of modeling type activities with the advent of the computer, because now we can do the calculations a lot faster than have in the old days where we had just rooms full of people with adding machines and abacuses trying to figure out the derivative of a concentration with respect to time. So we have a lot of uses, research, model building and testing, and trying to discover, in our case, sources of contamination, things like export coefficients, event mean concentrations, variability, what's happening in very localized places in the watershed. From a management perspective, we're interested in nutrient trading, perhaps, because there's that potential, and it's something that the Environmental Protection Agency has considered to be interesting. We want to do prediction to look at compliance and maybe management of individual loads, and then integrating models with the monitoring network. And that's where our touch point is with what Jeff talked about. This notion that I had, and others I'm sure have been thinking about this longer than I have because I'm really young. I'll start in a project we had. That was a joke, by the way. I'm not as old as Jack, but I'm still pretty old. In the northwestern part of the U.S., in fact, just about as far northwest in the U.S. you can go without being in Alaska, in the Nooksack watershed, which is what you see here. Seattle's kind of way down here, and here's Vancouver, Canada over here, and Bellingham is right in through here, and here's freshwater lakes and so forth. Anyway, we had a project whereby we did mathematical modeling in this watershed. And as you see, if you can see these little green shapes on here, those are the individual drainages. And each of those individual drainages was designated such that they were operating more or less in parallel with all the others. Okay, so you have rainfall and runoff on this drainage. It delivers water down to a downstream receiving water. You have rainfall and runoff in this drainage and base flow in this drainage. It does the same thing, and that one over there is going this way, and that one's going this way, all happening more or less in parallel, independent of the others, except by how they're connected through the climate system and weather and similar soils and so forth and so on. But each is an individual actor, if you will. So we kind of got started there. And so this was a situation where we had this mountainous watershed in the Pacific Northwest. And as part of the project we were asked to simulate hydrology and water quality and aquatic habitat in this system on a daily time step for 30 years of simulation. Okay, and we had 300 drainages, 13 river segments, and of these 13, there were only 2 that were dependent on upstream segments, so 11 independently acting in parallel river segments. And so we had to execute this model and to try to get information from this data that we collected, where we had hydrology, and including diversions, took several days to do, and we had watershed pollutant loading that was taking about a 1-day time frame to do. We had in-stream modeling that was taking about 7 days, and then there's a lake in here, so we had the in-lake response, and that would take about a day. And if you add all these things together, it took about 14 days to do a single model run. Okay? And the idea of doing a single model run from either a research or a management perspective is kind of, well, that's interesting, but we want to do hundreds of these things. So if you multiply 14 times hundreds, you get lots of model runs, you get lots of time, and you get careers that are tied up in doing this kind of work. Okay, and so my solution to all this was to get some students and some postdocs and my kids, literally, to sit in front of computers for several days, this computer, that computer, and that computer, to try to parallelize this process and get the solution to this in something less than 14 days. And we managed to get this down to 2 or 3 days. All right, so we have this kind of multi-parallel problem. Okay, we have parallelism in the watershed with the individual drainages and the river segments that are operating. And as we'll see, there's even parallelism at a much finer resolution. We also have parallelism in how the models are simulated, how they're executed. And then if we do this several model runs, then we can increase the amount of parallelism even more. Okay, so there was a better solution to this than recruiting your kids to sit in front of computers and feed them pizza for three or 4 days. There was an example that we, not us, but another group in Arkansas at the time, was looking at a watershed, and small agricultural watershed, and built a model using an off-the-shelf model called, just dropped out of my head. What's that model called? SWAT. Very commonly used model for agricultural TM, total maximum daily load work. Okay, and they wanted to do sensitivity and uncertainty analysis and found that they had to do 43,000 runs of this model in order to get the results they wanted. Okay, one run was about a 10-minute clock time. Okay, so if you have one computer doing all 43,000 runs, you do the math, and it's about a year to get the simulations done. Okay, and that's just a year sitting in front of a computer pushing go every 10 minutes. Okay. And so what their solution was to look at what was called a cloud network of lots of computers scattered all over the world. I'm not going to go into the details of this, but kind of growing up around the world is realization that computers are mostly sitting unused. They're sitting there doing nothing except reading your email. Okay. So someone said, and probably groups of people said, let's take advantage of that and let's develop the protocols for allowing us to use all of these computers that are sitting there consuming electricity but not doing anything, like in the middle of the night. Okay, so let's create this so-called cloud of computers, and you see this all the time now. You see cloud computing and computing in the network and all this kind of stuff. And it's always for stuff like doing Google searches and stuff that really isn't all that interesting from a scientific point of view. When these things were really built to calculate things. Okay, let's use these all to calculate things. They're really good at it. And they do it really fast, except that one computer can only do so much. Well, we have all these thousands, millions, if you will, computers scattered all over the world. And so they took this 1 year to do their 43,000 runs and reduced the time using this cloud network down to 14 days. Okay, and that was huge. Okay, that's a 25 times speed up of this process. Okay, and with about 50% overhead, this represented about 250 computers. This is a very small fraction of the available computers around the world. Okay, so that was seen to be a better solution. So this started my gears turning a little bit, and my gears turn pretty slowly, so you guys can kind of pick this up and run with it if you want. And we have our Little Bear River watershed. And here we are in the western U.S. I first gave this talk in New Zealand where no one really knew where the Little Bear River was, if you can imagine that. So I had to show them, and so here I am zooming in on the Little Bear River, and this is the picture that Jeff showed. And so here's our watershed. And in terms of parallelism in watersheds, we have parallelism in scale, where we generate a grid on the land surface, and we try to figure out what's going on in these grid cells. And these might be 3 meters, they might be 10 meters in size. We have drainages that are in parallel, and I talked about that where we look at the little green shapes on the Nooksack River system. We have watersheds that are operating in parallel, so accumulations of grids. We have stream segments that are operating in parallel within a particular drainage. And we have lakes and reservoirs that can also be operating in parallel, and then we have aquifers that have often very long response times that can be operated in parallel also. And here I'm talking about parallelism in the context of how you do the calculations. Okay, so the whole thing kind of comes down to this, and this being Halloween, I figured garlic would be a nice, to keep the vampires away. But these are the watersheds, and they're all tied to the central stock, and down here is the outlet of the river, and there might be a reservoir in here somewhere hidden in the north. So this is kind of the idea, and every one of these bulbs is operating in parallel. Okay, whatever it's doing it in parallel. This one drives that vampire away, this one drives that vampire away, and so we go on from there. Okay, so in the Little Bear River, here's our realization of the Little Bear River, where we see, starting from this nice map that shows the entire watershed, we split this thing up into smaller drainages. And there are, I believe, 18 of these things. And each of those drainages is connected directly to a river segment, and each of those drainages can be computed in terms of a model in parallel, independent of the others, given the same sort of input information. So there it is again. And so we select, say, watershed number 17, and we zoom in on that one, and then we zoom in a little more, and what we do in terms of figuring out the rainfall and runoff characteristics is we split this thing into a grid. And there are lots of representations of geophysical data, digital elevation models and soil types and land use and those types of things that are established on this grid. And the grid can be, as we said, 10 meters, which is kind of the common size. 3 meters is a fine resolution. And I've heard of some of these done at a 1 meter resolution, where it's huge amounts of data collection and so forth. And we have all these grid elements that get rainfall applied to them. They generate contaminants in the form of nutrients, perhaps, or some other type of contaminant. Then they deliver that contaminant somewhere downstream. Okay, so looking at one of these, the types of information we have is land use and land cover, all provided in parallel, rainfall and runoff, slope and aspect, and then some sort of variable saturation analysis where we understand how much moisture there is in the soil before it rains, how much after, to figure out whether or not we're going to generate runoff. Some more hydraulics information, and we get a contaminant load that gets delivered downstream. Okay, now, one way that we can look at this grid cell scale and convert this into a parallel system is that there are some, and my apologies to the real hydrologists in the room, I'm just playing one on TV here, is that does true overland flow really exist? Okay, we think of overland flow as being this one molecule deep sheet of water that's running across a watershed. Okay, and I've never seen this happen, honestly, the one molecule deep. This even flows at a very small scale organize themselves. Okay, and we see them forming into little rivulets, and those rivulets form into bigger rivulets, and the bigger rivulets form into even bigger ones, and those form into small streams and swales and all these kinds of things over a long period of time. And so at some grid scale that we thought once looked like this, where we had sheets of water flowing from one grid cell to the next, instead we look at these grid cells like this, and my apologies, it's down here at the bottom, where each grid cell doesn't deliver water directly to the soil in the next grid cell, but it delivers it to some sort of drainage system, and that drainage system connects to the next grid cell's drainage system, and then you get parallel flow into the rivulet from there, and that continues on down through all these grid cells. And so the processes that generate flow and contaminant load at a grid scale can be thought of as acting in parallel, because what's going on here is going into that little collector. What's going on here is going independently into this collector, and these collectors are connected just in the same way that watersheds are connected by their river sections. All right, so we're zooming in way down, and I'm not sure what the dimensions of this grid cell are yet. We haven't gotten that far. But each grid cell can be thought of as acting independently or can be calculated in parallel. Okay, large-scale climate models, those are really the drivers. So those kind of cover over all of these watersheds, and they become the similar sorts of pieces that drive the models. But we're not going to consider those here. We look at the watershed scale. We have rainfall, runoff, and groundwater flows, local scale detection of saturation and infiltration excess that generates runoff in particular areas, and so forth. And so we need to collect data on things like locations of drains and human activities, proximities to watershed or watercourses, slope and aspect of adjacent watersheds. All of these are collected in order to generate the data. Now, I'll skip through this quickly. This is some work that we did on the, in our Little Bear River project on the SEEP project, where we're trying to look at what was going on with the drainage system where we have human intervention that might disrupt this concept of parallelism. And these are, in this case, we're showing areas that are in green here that are not intercepted by drains, by human activities. Because in our area where we have lots of canals and diversions and so forth, those canals are designed, in some cases, not only to deliver water, but also to collect runoff. And often those drains those canals, which are shown in blue here, kind of protect the river from the effects of the watershed. Some elements of slope and aspect and so forth, and which are shown here. And anyway, the idea here is that we're trying to find parts of the watershed that are more likely to deliver pollutants than other parts of the watershed. One of the other problems we ran into with all this is the concept of, I call it the milking parlor versus the dairy farm. When you look at land use data, which is kind of delivered to you on a grid scale, it's agriculture or animal feeding or something along those lines. And the categories aren't really fine enough to distinguish here. So a dairy farm is, you know, a farm. There's pastures and cows in pastoral scenes and music playing in the background, and these things are grazing all over the place. Fairly low intensity relative, let's say, to a milking parlor. It's scattered across the landscape, except for the part of it that's a milking parlor. And milking parlors, as we can see as we drive down towards Wellsville, are very concentrated pollutant sources. I would call them industrial polluting sources because the high concentration of the polluting elements, which are the cows. They're all standing around and slopping around in their own manure, and there's large quantities of waste generation. The landscapes are fairly flat. They tend to get saturated, and you see cows with, you know, mud up to their bellies, so that suggests that there's a lot of mud on the ground that's potentially causing ponding of water and likelihood to deliver the water and the contaminants to a downstream receiving water. Lower gradient, lots of waste production, and things like wash waters and so forth. So using this concept, then we worked with Matt Baker, formerly of USU, now out in Maryland, to look at how to calculate the likelihood that a particular set of grid cells in one of these areas is going to be saturated and deliver contaminants. We did this on a seasonal basis. Here's winter, spring, summer, fall, and then total to find out places in the watershed that are more likely than others to generate contaminants that flow into the system. Okay, so the physical situation we're talking about here is watersheds that are connected to river segments in a highly parallel manner. We have many independent actors. We've listed grid cells and drainages and stream segments and sources and reservoir operations and so forth. We have some dependencies, most of which are one-way dependencies as we go downstream. Loadings from drainages into the rivers, it's normally not the case that the river reloads the watershed, although during a flood situation you can imagine that happening. And then downstream river segments getting information from upstream river segments. We can have some two-way communication, two-way dependencies, like if we have diversions that cross watershed boundaries, that can be a two-way type of communication because that watershed that receives the diversion water can flow back into the watershed from which it was delivered. Irrigation return flows, groundwater that doesn't respect watershed boundaries necessarily, reservoirs, and so forth, and some of the constituents that we're concerned with. Okay. Now, this is not the Little Bear, this is actually the Bear River from kind of the Utah line on upstream into Idaho, that shows that if you take a big picture of the watershed, you get this kind of view. If you zoom in on part of it, it kind of looks the same. Okay, so it has this so-called fractal nature, whereas you change the scale, it doesn't really change the nature. And this is true down to a pretty fine scale. This is what I was talking about in talking about these organization of surface flows into rivulets and so forth. And so you get this highly parallel picture at many levels. The biochemical situation, here is a list of contaminants that are in a very commonly used water quality model. Many of these contaminants interact. Temperature, oxygen, biochemical oxygen demand, all are interactive. Nutrients and the growth of algae all interact, but some water quality constituents act independently of others and can be represented independently. This list is fairly long. This is for a river. Here's another list that's used for a reservoir. Again, some of these are independent, others interact, and so some of those things that we need to sort out when we do calculations would depend on the interaction levels. So in terms of modeling then, this is kind of the flow diagram that we use. We're up the top in the blue. We set up a model environment. We collect data to populate the model and format the data so it can be fed in. We get the data from Jeff's distributed water quality monitoring network. We have a rainfall runoff model to generate flows. We look at the impact on the soils. We look at the generation of pollutants. This is all done in series. these types of things. But then we work down in here and we start looking at things in parallel. Pollutant generation by grid cell. This is what we call the parallel process. Accumulation of grid cell loads into rivulets. Accumulation of rivulets into higher order streams. Routing of contaminants through stream segments and through reservoirs and things like that. Okay, so here we have separation into, this is a little bear again, separation into 18 drainages. In the Bear River that I just showed you, here we have a kind of a stick and arrow or a stick and node diagram that shows parallelism in terms of the loads being generated from different watersheds. And this one flows into here, this one flows into here. So for example, these two can be calculated independently of the others. So this sort of parallelism can be taken advantage of. This is an upper portion of a watershed. This is a lower portion of the watershed. This can be done before this, except when you connect this river to that river. Okay, so all of this can be done separately, and if you're thinking about what's going on, this can be happening in Denmark. This one can be calculated in Australia, the next one in Logan, that one in Canada, and so forth. All of these things are going on in parallel, so my 1 year is going into 14 days. From our previous example. Okay, now if you have a serial computer like I have right here, if I do everything on here, then every process has to wait for the others. So that's why it takes so long. So we have independent units that must wait in a queue for processing. We have to make sure all the units are completed, so you might have to wait for some to catch up. And then we have a very common problem that we have is that water models were developed back in the 1970s before the idea of parallel computing existed. So the codes we have are not conducive to parallel processing, even though we can execute those individual codes on parallel computers. So there's a finer level of parallelism that we can take advantage of by recoding the models to take advantage of the fact that this computer has 2 processors on it. I've got one in my office that has 8 processors on it. All right, some of the resources we have available. This is a computer lab in the engineering building. As you can see, we have rows and columns of computers. And one thing to notice that this is during the day, that's a window back there. Oops, where'd my thing go? Oh, it must be in the next slide. Large resources of computers. One thing to notice is that there's no one sitting at these things. They're sitting there all on, burning electricity, burning coal, or burning turns of the solar or the wind turbine or the solar panel, doing absolutely nothing interesting except what Microsoft tells them to do, which is pretty much nothing interesting. Okay. Right, screensavers. All right, so we have a lot of these resources around. Every university has at least 5 labs just like that one. Big universities have 50 of these things. Computing centers all over the world are sitting there doing nothing. And this rolls from day to night as the world turns, you know. And so you're sitting at 5 o'clock, you can start your computer network going, but at 8 in the morning, you can start up the one that's in Denmark or in Cairo or somewhere else to have your work done because it's nighttime over there. Okay. Now modern computers are multi-threading, they have multi-cores, and you can do, even on computers like this, parallel processing. Okay, and I've written some simple codes to do that, and it works okay. It about doubles the speed of a single calculation. If you do it twice, you can do it in the same time it takes to do it once. Yeah, with a little bit of overhead, maybe 20%. It's not too bad. We have local networks. We have scores of similar computers linked in a network configuration, and we have cooperating clusters of these networks all over the world, sitting there doing nothing. Okay. There's a big push for parallel computing. IBM and Harvard are creating a community-driven grid computing model. Scientists at Purdue are using unused computer cycles, and the percentage, they're trying to sort this out. Unused computer cycles here in St. Louis. Computer users discover windfall on faculty desktops. All right, so when you're in class and someone else can be using your computer. Here's a lab, another lab in the engineering building that we use for teaching. Notice how many users there are in here. None. Here's our picture of our main lab again, and we see, oh, there's someone back there, I think, okay, using this lab. Purdue builds a 1,200 node supercomputer before lunch. Okay, I don't know if they started after breakfast or if they got up early to do this, but the point is that this kind of stuff is available to you. I just read in the BBC last night that China has now leapfrogged Oak Ridge National Lab for their supercomputer. Okay, and they're able to do 2.5, what was it, petaflops. Okay, a petaflop is a whole bunch of multiplications, trillions, bazillions, let's call it. And Oak Ridge can only do 1.5 petaflops. But when they described this computer, it wasn't one monolithic machine. Let's go back. Hang on. I'll come back to that. That's the Purdue question again. So instead of having one monolithic machine, and this is the old Cray computer where they tried to speed it up by building the processors around the central core to shorten the wires. They were down to getting shorter wires to get things to go faster. That seems so prosaic now, so kind of last century. Because this new thing in China has 8,000 multi-core processors all connected in parallel. They're calling that one computer. It's in 5 rooms. It weighs 15 tons. It has air conditioning that would cool Phoenix, probably, because it's going to get really hot. But that's this new model. It's not one of a single machine doing all these things. It's all these kind of lower class machines working in concert with one another and organizing your computations in such a way that things get interesting. So here's my picture of this whole thing. So here's how we're going to be doing parallel computing in the future. Every one of these machines might have 2, 4, 8, 16. I'm sure the sky's the limit. Intel's going to come out with a 128 core processor someday, and we're all going to throw our mere 64 core processors in the garbage and go buy one of those things so we can do email and screensavers faster. But if I'm a clever programmer, I can write my code in order to use all 128. I'll leave one of them for email and screensavers, so people won't think the computer's doing nothing as it's actually doing serious work. But every one of these is going to get expanded into more capacity. Okay, and so our challenge is to write the new model codes to take advantage of the fact that not only do we have these clusters of network computers, and the networks are networked with other networks all over the world, but we have computers that can do a ton of work on their own. Okay, and our computing power, China's going to brag about their petaflop computing center, and we're going to have that same thing in our lab and engineering building when these computers get replaced by 64 and 128 processors and so forth. We just have to learn how to take advantage of it. Okay. Now, there's a downside to all this. This is from New Zealand. New Zealand Post announces moving all of its email services to cloud computing. What that means is that somewhere in the world there's someone who's looking after New Zealand's email. Okay, and there's a lot of little computers that are doing it. So IT companies are a little bit worried that they're going to go out of business because of this. So grim outlook for them. Okay, so conventional approach, this is too long to read, but you have this serial set of processes that take a long time. The revised approach, we consider the structure of the hardware. We can have single computers with several cores and several processors. We can have local clusters, and a cluster is 2 computers like we have right here. This is a cluster, or up to 150 in the engineering lab, even more in the larger computing centers. Regional and wider scale cooperators in the presence of a supercomputer in that network, like the one in China or the one in Oak Ridge, to handle these really large, very time-consuming jobs. Single computer scale, matrix computations are the crux of the problem. Models have often thousands of simultaneous equations. Some of them linear, a lot of times they're nonlinear. We also have now these very fast and very modern and compact sparse matrix calculating routines that take the old 1,000 by 1,000 matrix and can convert it into something that's much smaller, much faster. We need careful coding, which means we need training for people to learn how to code in parallel ways. And then at some point, we have to figure out what to do with all these old model legacy codes that have been around for years and years and years that we can't really adapt too well to parallel processing on a single computer. Okay. We can have memory sharing. There are open source protocols among computers for using memory from different areas. There are commercial vendors for this, and this is the cloud computing thing that you're hearing about, but we have to optimize the approaches to do these kinds of things. A local cluster, though, has a high throughput, a lot of interaction. There's data sharing over this network, but we have issues with network speeds and moving files around and so forth. Then the cloud computing, and this is kind of a New Zealand reference, called the Nightstore water heater. If you're not familiar with the concept, it's in New Zealand you have a water heater that's huge, and it gets powered up during the night when electricity is cheap and no one's using it. And you heat up a whole lot of water, and then the thing shuts off, and that's the hot water you have for the day. It doesn't come back on until nighttime again. Okay, so we have this concept where we have this unused computing capacity that operates at night, and so you only use it at night when people are no longer sitting at their desks using their computers. We take advantage of this underused capacity, and we have this scheduling computations for off-peak time. So there's a lot of coordination that has to take place there. There's some progress already. Biotech labs use this kind of thing for gene sequencing all the time. There's a lot of computing that goes into gene sequencing, and they have little segments of genes that are done in parallel. Some legacy codes for water quality modeling. The National Science Foundation has up to $5 million in seed grants for learning how to do this type of computing. The Department of Energy has just announced a massive program to learn how to do parallel processing for things like groundwater contaminant transport and so forth. And we're thinking of putting in a proposal for that. And again, you might incur the wrath of IT vendors. Okay, so where do we go from here? I'm in the process, and I've got a student who's gotten interested in this, developing an integrated model of hydrology, watershed loading, stream response, reservoirs, groundwater interface with a parallel structure, both at the local level, this computer, versus a network computer. And all these things, of course, will be interactive. Okay, so I'm gone on way too long here, but the key to doing this is to find, at the local level, matrix creation and inversion routines that are done with sparse, parallelized codes, and we manage memory in order to minimize disk activity, because that really slows things down. Okay, so I'll stop there. That's kind of where we're headed.